Okay, well, I guess it's time to try another VPG game. This is Franco Prussian War 40. And in some ways, I would say, geez, this kind of doesn't fit my usual taste, right? I usually like the big games with a lot of meat in them. On the other hand, I'm very impressed with SPI's World War I and a couple of other earlier games. I've stayed away from the VPG Series 20, the Napoleonic 20s, for just that reason. They looked like they were too heavy on thinking with just a few units on the board and not enough on telling the story. I do own one, at least, maybe more than one, but I got it kind of as a freebie thrown in a package deal on a used thing. This, however, like I said, I do like some smaller games, and I think this is at about the level where I kind of enjoy a smaller game. And the rulebook isn't that terribly small. Other things going perhaps against it, it's a Joseph Miranda game. I've tended not to like Miranda's games. Most of them came out most of the ones that I've seen came out in the magazine days. I think S&T's. I think that's what he was in charge of. And, well, a lot of them were very, they had events charts, political aspects, etc., all kind of stuff that I think I would like, but somehow they fell flat for me. However, he did do Franco Prussian War, which I don't own, but I own the Russo-Turkish War. And the system for that I really liked. So I wanted to see what his take would be on something in a more modern period. Now this is, again, a review copy provided from VPG. This is a more traditional VPG packaging style. It comes in the little sturdy baggie, but small game. And you can see I've trimmed the counters, but you can see they're already having trouble with maybe either this counter setting. I don't know if you can notice that. That's not really my fault. That's sort of the gluing. Seems like it was just perforated before the two pieces were glued together and they weren't aligned properly. And then you got always this kind of flaky stuff here. Which nothing can be done about. But this was the first time that I've seen one where they were really, maybe not the first, but it certainly was notable to me. It's not often the case where the alignment was incorrect on the press job between the two counter sheets. Nice little small map showing France and Germany. Bunch of cards. What's up with that? Yeah, little player aid to track morale, game turn, and gives you some additional information in here, which is necessary if you're going to make such a small map. You don't want to use up that valuable real estate on this. And then a couple of duplicates of the same player aid card, which give you the sequence of play, the terrain effects chart, and the combat rules here, and such not. Great. All right, let's dive into the rules. I usually set up a game before I want to go into the rules, but in the case of this one, well, we can look at some more components. In the case of this one, the setup is very much up to the players. Your counters are your standard kind of combat factor movement allowance on them. They have other information that largely doesn't matter for the game itself. Historical information like, hey, is it a corps or an army? What does it belong to? I'm not seeing, maybe it's up here. I think this is the turn that it comes into play. And you kind of have to follow the rules to set up the game. Unlike some games, it doesn't just tell you where to put everything. I played something recently, Grand Illusion, where all the counters were very easy to find where they go. Here it's not absolutely clear what's starting on the map. I think most things do. You have some optional units like these detachments. There's going to be breakdown rules in the optional rules. Dummy counters. There's hidden movement, and that's another factor of why it's not set up, because all the counters are going to flip over, and there's complete fog of war. Now that's an option in the game, but the optional rules strike me as kind of not just good and cool. I might have left out fog of war if that was the case, but actually kind of integral to getting the full experience of this game. We also have, this is what I do to counter sheets. I always end up trimming some little piece of information off them and keeping it for unknown reasons. We have our fortifications, which have on their backside a besieged side. That also is an optional rule. You can see why I'm saying the optional rules feel almost necessary to me. I'm sure they're not. I'm sure you can play in a very interesting game without them. But to get the historical feeling for the time, I think that the optional rules are kind of largely necessary. You also have these little control counters. I had trouble clipping these, double-sided, for the French and the Germans. In addition to these kind of random decks of cards, and we'll look at them later, you have a political card that is not, I think, an optional rule. You change your it's possible for each of the players to go through a change. So, for example, the French start as the Second Empire, but they can go to become the Third Republic. Keeping track of all different French famous governments is difficult. The Germans start off as the Confederation and can end up as the Empire. And you've got information on these, for example, number of cards that you're allowed to hold, advantages to morale, that's what squares mean in this, and that's just an immediate effect to becoming the Empire, and that's spelled out there. Any special rules here? This is the rules for changing to the Empire. The rules for changing from the French Second Empire is basically the loss of the Imperial Guard, and we'll get to that in a moment. But there looks like there's other conditions for it here as well. And then over here, the effects once you become the Third Republic. And in both cases, the government change helps the player that it's affecting or afflicting in terms of how well they'll be able to handle the game, but there's a victory point penalty to losing the Empire. I think the game comes with a little sneeze dice. I'm not positive. In the rules, it actually states specifically that there isn't a die, but I probably removed it, but I can't be certain of that. I'm never sure what to do with those. All right, let's take a look at what we got here. It's actually a fairly thick rule book. It runs 24 pages. And at core, it's a very simple game, as the Series 20 is, from what I understand. But there's a lot more chrome in this, of course, being a Miranda design. I like chrome, though, so it looks better integrated than some of the designs that I never really liked. And that may have more to do with where I choose to do my gaming in terms of eras. All right, so the rulebook itself is actually organized in a non-procedural fashion. It reads very much like if you're used to, the S&T rulebooks. There is a lot of color, a little bit of color in it, not as much as in some of the others, and I found this fairly easy to digest because of the organization. I have very few of these highlighted sections. There is a use of color in these bars. However, I find that perfectly fine. Okay. So, There's two sets of rules for this, as there are in many series. There's a series set of rules, which covers most of what you'd be doing, and then some scenario or game-specific rules that come into play. In addition, there's optional rules in both cases. Okay, so let's take a look at the sequence of play on the series rules. So you start off with an operations phase. In this particular scenario, the Germans are always the first player, but they don't get the first couple phases in their first turn. That's often the case in a game. Now, they get to choose whether or not they want to take a rest and relaxation turn. And if so, they get a free card from that. They may buy an additional card for a circle. What's a circle? Yeah. So there's two kinds of points in the game that you're allowed to hold on to. You're allowed to, there's one type of point you're allowed to use. And I think you use these control markers for them as well. And these are circular, so that works. They're going to indicate friction points. Now, friction points in this game are something that you collect when you push your army too hard. And they're just collected as a nation, so the French friction points will go over in that box. And they have a maximum to how many they can hold in there. If it goes above that maximum, the excess are lost. And they give the enemy opportunities to do things to you. Basically, the enemy can call in their chips as they go. So it's not a big deal that there's a maximum. That just means you can't stockpile beyond a certain level. So, yeah, you can pay extra friction points if you take the rest and relaxation to get a second card. And then any additional cards that you want to draw from that, those are going to call you... I'm sorry, this is if you don't do rest and relaxation. Those are going to cost you a morale point each, and morale is tracked on here. It starts at 7. If it makes it to 0 in the system, that's the only system-defined victory conditions. This little note here is an optional rule. If your morale drops down to 1 or 2, it's going to lose a zone of control. All your units are going to lose their zone of control while you're at that low morale. And that's kind of indicative of things like mutinies and stuff that really debilitated armies at various times through World War I, really, in this era. All right, let's see what else we have here. So what happens if you do the rest and reorganization? I'll look over here. If you choose to do that as your turn, you get the following changes. First, you don't get any cards as a basis. Instead, you're allowed to discard as many cards as you like out of your hand and then bring your hand up to its limit in size. You get a bonus morale point. And you get to remove half your friction points. Now, I thought that was an or somewhere. Oh, no, it's in the admin phase that you have that option. Yeah, so you get all these bonuses here. During your movement, you're not going to be allowed to come close to the enemy. You can't enter their zones of control. And you follow retreat rules with any units that you choose to move, which means you have to move closer to your depots. We have the supply depot, the supply hexes. That's going to be your depots there. Unfortunately, they're all the same color as far as I can see, which may be a mistake. That looks just as black as that to me. And it seems to be a single one. But it's pretty obvious whose or who or where. During combat, if you're in a zone of control, you must conduct disengagement battles. they specify what the rules for that are. It's that you're going to get an attacker withdraws result for each battle. Now, that's important because in the rules itself, disengagement is something else that only Cav can do. That's actually forbidden in this game. Okay, so that's a quick jump over to what happens if you choose, and that's your whole turn, kind of some modifications to the whole turn, if you choose to do the rest in relaxation. Okay, reorganization within your game turn. But if instead you choose to go ahead, you get one of these bonuses at the beginning. You get a card at the beginning of the turn, and you can buy additional ones at the cost of, seems like somebody's shooting at me, at the cost of first a friction point and then worse morale points. Then you're allowed to mobilize, and you'll be placing your reinforcements on the board at this point. And you can also pay cards. Now, cards have this. Cards are often going to be used as a point, kind of like in a CDG, except they only have one. There's only one thing you can do. The cards can only be used to count as one towards something. So if a card's not really helping you, you can discard it for an effect. And in this case, you can discard it for the effect of getting replacements. Let's take a look at what the rules for that are. If you lose units that aren't out of supply, you'll be able to spend replacement points, which are triangles, but there's no counters for this. Generally, they may come from cards, but like specific cards may give you an option, like this one will give you this kind of an option of +1 friction and 2 replacement points, or you can take +1 friction point and then remove the card from play and get this extra unit. And that's playing the card for kind of an event, as it were. This is not a CDG, however. It's more a traditional wargame where the cards can be used in somewhat CDG type manner, in which they can be used as discards to do certain things or for the events that are on them. Okay, so when you play cards to generate replacement points, and I think you're unlimited to how many you play, you create a pool of them, and then you can replace the units, and I believe it's 1 strength point per card. Let's see how it's worded here. In this manner, you can replace unspent RPs. Example, you have a pair of 2 strength units and a 1/3 strength unit in your eliminated forces. During your mobilization phase, you play 2 cards for RPs that combine for a total of 2 friction points and 4 replacement points. Yeah, I'm trying to see where that point total is coming from. Oh, this is if you play it during the mobilization phase. This is what you get. You get a friction point and you get a mobilization point. So you're not really discarding the points for single points. You're discarding them, or you're playing them for their effect in that phase. Okay. Yes, this is a first look. But nobody else has covered this series yet, I think. Great. So I can't suggest that you go watch somebody else's video, because I'm still working my way through the rules. I mean, I read them, but you know how I am. Then the player's allowed to move, and essentially you pay your movement cost out of your movement allowance, and following the terrain effects chart, which has a movement point cost per unit. You notice there's a stop if you enter into a rough terrain. There is a rule, though, in this game that you can always move 1 hex. So, for example, if you wanted to move into the forest and you only had 1 movement point, you would still be allowed to do that. All right. You have to worry about zones of control in this game, and they're incredibly sticky here. By which I mean, you stop when you enter. You can't leave them if you start in them, except through the disengagement rules, which don't allow a lot of motion either. So they're very much locking zones of control. Then the second player is going to get a reaction phase. Now here, he can discard a card to allow one of his units to react, and that unit's allowed to react if it's a reserve unit. Reserve units are units that aren't in an enemy zone of control. They can move only 1 hex without having to worry about the movement point cost of that hex, as long as it's not through prohibited terrain. Then the first player is the current player is going to be conducting his battles, and battles here, I'll go into more detail on them, but battles here are going to be very much like the old SPI Avalon Hill games. You must attack all units you're adjacent to. All units that are all your units that are adjacent to enemy units must attack. However, you're allowed to do soak-off attacks kind of without restriction as far as I can tell. So you could have 1 weak unit attack a bunch of stronger units surrounding it, enabling another unit to get a stronger attack on whatever it's adjacent to. And as a quick example, you know, if I'm... let's get these guys in somewhat reasonable order here. If I'm in this kind of position, right, this unit could attack both of these, and this unit could attack this and get bigger differential, because it's not going to be an odd system for combat. We use the combat differential here. And wow, it looks like I should be rolling funky dice against this, but no. This is just the results that you get, and I'll explain those. Why not now? Why not? So when you do battle, you indicate all your attacks before you start rolling for any of them. And then you make a comparison of the strength points between them. Now, the defender's allowed to spend attacker friction points, circles over in the attacker box. You can just remove them, and those are going to subtract from the strength. Then you total the defender's strength, and you add to that the defense effect terrain effects chart. And we got like a little asterisk here, which tells us it's only if all attacking units come through the river. All pretty standard stuff. Okay. The result, when you, let's not jump ahead. Now, if you're playing with the optional siege rolls and there's a fortress present, it could be a siege and you could be rolling on the siege table, but we'll get to that later. Assuming that's not the case, the attacker may play a card face up to affect the battle, and you'll see the card we looked at before had it. Here, this one has a combat effect. So you could add a strength point to each German unit in battle, attacking or defending, that's not stacked with another unit. And then the defender, after he sees the effect of the attacker's card, is allowed to play a card to affect the battle. Then, at this point, you know what the differential is, and you find the column that you're going to roll on. You roll a die, and you get a result. Okay, we haven't explained the results, though. The results are coming down here. Major defeat, which is 2 like skulls. That eliminates the entirety of the defeated side. And the red and green. Green is going to be results that apply to the attacker. Red is going to apply to the defender. White boxes apply to both players. Okay, so a major defeat would say that the defender loses all his units, and he's going to take morale loss for the units he loses. We'll get to what those morale losses are later. A minor defeat means that one unit, and I believe that's the strongest unit, single strongest mobile unit in a force, is going to be removed, is going to be put in the destroyed pile, and then he takes his morale losses. All the surviving defeated units must retreat a hex towards their supply source, towards a supply source. It doesn't have to be the closest one. And then the victor is allowed to do an advance after combat, but if he does so, he gains a friction point for it. Routed, which is this little arrow thing indicated here, the victor rolls a die for each defeated unit in battle to see how many hexes it retreats, as far as I can tell. The rules don't nail this down particularly well, but that's the only interpretation I can get. That's actually what it seems to say right here very clearly. The rules don't nail it down, the card does. Any unit that retreats more than its movement allowance is going to cost you in morale. And remember, morale is the core way you win the game. You drop somebody to 0, you win. You both drop to 0 at the same time, and it's a tied game. And the victor, again, has the opportunity to advance after combat for 1 friction point. Note that in the major defeat, he can advance after combat without having to pay that friction point cost. Routed, that's what we just did. When a side is routed, or the attacker, or for the attacker in an indecisive battle, that side gains an additional friction point. And then we'll get that in a moment. In a withdrawal, all defeated units have to retreat 1 hex, and then the victor is allowed to advance after combat for 1 friction point. And in indecisive, you eliminate 1 defending unit. The attacker then must also eliminate a unit, and then each side is going to take a loss in morale. And note, when we're looking at the indecisive battle, for example, there's the friction point for the attacker marked there as well. Right. Stacking, 2 units per hex for the most part. Again, when we get to the optional rules, there's some changes here. Okay, let's look at operations cards. So as you're drawing cards, you get to look at them before you decide whether to buy another one. If it's an event card, you must play it immediately with a headline on it. Otherwise, it's in your hand and you can use it in the phases that it's indicated on the card. And it may have a requirement that you have to pay some effects for it. Cards will generally be discarded, but some are going to be removed from play. If you can't trace... Okay, if you take a loss of a unit at any point and you can't trace supply, your unit's going to be permanently eliminated. That's really the only effect of being out of supply here. To trace supply, you have to trace in a number of hexes to a rail line, and then trace the rail line back to one of your supply sources. Like in Grand Illusion that I just played, the topography of the rail lines is going to be important. You can see here, you get caught trying to use this rail line. If it gets cut here, it's not going to make it anywhere. Of course, the number of hexes, I believe, is given in the exclusive rules, but in this case, the French can trace 2 hexes, the Germans 3, but that may change by cards or who knows, you know. All right, let's go back here. Then we go to the administrative phase after combat. And the first player is going to have, the current player is going to have a choice of whether to take a card for free or lose half of his friction, Or he can just pass. Why would he pass? Well, I'm not sure. If he has no friction and you don't want to half it, that half is rounded up. So if you only have one, you lose it. And you don't want to draw a card. That's important because if you have too many cards, you have to discard down to your hand limit. And then you check for any morale changes and you discard down to hand size. And then your units, if you're playing with it, will flip over. And you're allowed to spawn a free dummy piece if you're playing with that option again. All right. And then the second player goes, and then the turn track moves. Great. So let's see if there's any other little pieces that I've missed here. I talked about how sticky the zones are. I haven't talked too much about fortresses. So fortresses negate zones of control. They don't go into or out of the hex, which means if you're stacked in a fortress, you're not required to attack. Again, the rules aren't absolutely nailing this down, but what I feel they mean is that if you attack with a unit out of the fortress, it's as though it has left the fortress and now it's now zones of control apply to it for the combat phase that it's in, which means it must attack all the units surrounding it. If it's alone, if it's not alone, well, then it applies with the other units. But you can choose to keep units sort of in the fortress protected from that must attack requirement. I talked about supply. The reaction phase, I kind of talked about that too. There's one reaction move that doesn't apply in this game, which is you can do a disengagement move with cav units that are adjacent to enemy units. That's not allowed in this game. I'm not going to explain it any further, but it's available for the rest of the system. It's just in this particular war that doesn't apply. Okay. If you attack a fortress and you get a result that has retreat as part of that result, the retreat has no effect on any of the units involved in the fortress, which makes fortresses very hard to attack and defeat. You either have to kind of catch them alone. Well, obviously, if you get the major defeat, it'll wipe the fortress out. But otherwise, you pretty much have to catch it alone because a destruction will affect a mobile unit before it affects the fortress. The fortress can be affected, though, by those, which isn't absolutely clear here, but it is clear in the rules. If you can't retreat, you die. If you can't retreat without violating stacking restrictions, you retreat first and then resolve the stacking penalty. And if you're overstacked, basically you have to eliminate a unit of your choice. Units only attack once each turn. See, we got another special unit, which is elite units. If units are designated as elite, and they'll have, I guess, this yellow here, the Imperial Guard is given that. They're allowed to subtract 2 from any route result that they get, and if they end up less than, it really is less than or equal to 1, but, well, no, less than 1, because they still get the rest of the route effects here, which don't strike me as anything. If they retreat, if the die roll is small enough, then they only withdraw 1 hex, but they still do have to fall back. And there might be special rules as to elites being replaceable or not. Okay. The optional rules, army demoralization, we talked about that. That's the 1 or 2. You lose your zone of control. I'm going to need to get some juice here because this camera eats up its battery. But at least it's small. There's a strategic movement as an optional rule. So there's 2 options for strategic movement. One's naval movement, which I don't think exists in this game, since there's not much room for fleets. And I'll ignore that because that's only handled in the exclusive rules of games that have it. The other is rail movement. You're allowed to take one of your friendly units and strategic move it during a movement phase, up to 10 connected rail hexes. You must stop if you enter an enemy zone of control. Rail hexes for both supply and movement, for them to operate, they have to kind of connect to supply sources. You can't trace supply across this rail line. And presumably there's a supply source down here off map. It's not covered that I could see in the rules from my memory. So you could trace from this maybe, as long as it's not broken. But you have to have 2 friendly controlled cities in order to trace supply or to do the strategic movement through a rail. And you're also not allowed to go invading the enemy using strategic movement. So that's actually specified here. Let me see. You cannot, well, no, that's just, I'm not sure if that, it's italics. I don't know if that's actually supposed to be rules or what. You cannot ride rails into unconquered enemy territory even if there are no enemy units there. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Okay. Another option is the siege rules. That's the siege table, and I haven't looked at it before. In the midst of a battle, between steps C and D in the battle, basically once the strength has been determined but before the cards are played, you follow this, and the attacking force must be supplied. The attacking force must have strength points equal to at least the defending force, the fortress and whatever units are in it. Both players, starting with the defender, can play a card. You roll a die. I haven't mentioned these suckers. In the midst of a combat, you can force your opponent, you can take one of your opponent's friction point markers away in order to force a reroll of the entire battle. However, in Siege, you can't. And then you'll get a result here that you read off of it that could have an effect. So, for example, it could be a sortie that forces the attacker to withdraw. It could just be a normal battle where the siege effects don't come into play. You could reduce the fortress, and fortresses have counters to be reduced in strength. And if that eliminates it, there's going to be a morale cost. And then you go ahead and fight. Or, Honors of War, you eliminate the fortress without a morale check, morale loss, and the defending mobile units are retreated to another city, and this just ends the battle right there. No advance, nothing like that is specified. All right. Fog of War. So Fog of War allows players to hide what their units are, and it introduces these dummy units. Now this is kind of interesting. All the hidden units count as normal units for all purposes, all the dummies included. You can spawn a dummy during your movement phase by spending opponent friction points to do so. You also get one for free during administration, and you may get them from other reasons. When it's spawned, you pull it out of your reorg box and add it to a hex containing friendly hidden units, and then you can move. Once a dummy is revealed, it'll be removed from the map. This has no effect on morale. You can move dummies up to 4 movement points, but there aren't a lot of 4 movement point units, and the opponent's going to know that you have weak cav there, because all the cav is pretty weak, if you move that fast. If you only go 2 or 3, they may think that you have a different kind of unit there. Now the hidden units are going to be turned face up, whenever the owner wants, by card, or if you have to reveal what the unit is, the type of the unit, for example, infantry to conduct sieges. We didn't hit that here. In order to do a siege and be in position for this, I believe, in addition to the requirements here, that you have to have the fortress under siege, which is flipped over. In order to have a fortress under siege, let's see. You had to start your movement phase adjacent to it, and then instead of moving, you flip it. And once the enemy mobile units are no longer adjacent, the city will become unbesieged. Now, when you're besieged, your units are both immobile and unsupplied as long as the state continues. This is kind of interesting because if your fortresses are on the front line, the attacker positions himself, he can cut them off along with the troops in them without much effort, but with time. There's only, well, I think it's 12 turns to the standard game. I'll probably play the advanced game, which goes 20 turns or 16 turns, because it looks more interesting. Let's see. So the other effect of siege combat is that you can use the siege table at that point. So you can't use that unless you've gone through the effort of putting the units under siege. Okay, getting back to our dummies. After you designate a battle, the first thing that happens is all players reveal any dummy units, any battle forces that are entirely dummies at that point. That battle doesn't take place and there's no advance after combat. But I think those dummies are able to provide a soak-off attack and screen things. So even if the opponent knows you have dummies, you can still utilize them in a way that can help you screen some units from combat. Your units remain face up until step D of your own administrative phase. So if you end up having your units revealed on you in combat, even if you're able to move them afterward during your turn, if you were attacked, you defeat the enemy, say, or retreat or whatever, your units will still be face up until the end of your phase. Another optional rule is reorganization. The way this works is units that have at least 3 strength points can be broken down into a number of detachments equal to 1 less than the number of strength points they have. Obviously, that's kind of an iffy trade-off for some flexibility because you're losing a strength point. The unit that's broken down goes, I guess, in your reorg box. It's not available to be rebuilt, but you can exchange it if you have destroyed detachments into the reorg box. The detachments can go into the reorg box, and then the destroyed unit that would match 1 more strength point than the destroyed detachments that you put in the box would then be available for rebuilding. You can also do the same on the map if you have them stacked together, and that's during what phase? This build-up's at the end of your movement. Let's see if I can find this somewhere. Unit breakdown at the beginning of your movement. So you can break units down at the beginning and then build them back up at the end. Don't see much advantage to that because the detachments are particularly slow. So by taking a dispersed formation, you're not going to gain any movement or anything. You're also limited to your dummy pile, or your detachment pile, and your dummy pile, which are specified by the scenario and the counter mix, essentially. Okay. Now, specifics for the Franco Prussian War. Everything we've dealt with there is the core rules to the game. Specifics for Franco Prussian, the French Imperial Guard Corps. It is not elite, even though it's the unit pictured as elite. It has no intrinsic special abilities, but if you lose it, Napoleon III is taken with it. And this immediately causes some losses of a huge morale swing of 2 off the French and 1 added to the Germans. It's gone from the game, and it's going to change the government as well, perhaps. I think it is a requirement there. Conditions for the Third Republic. The German player rolls a die during administrative phase after checking morale adjustments. If the result is less than or equal to the current difference in morale, no, it doesn't look like it has any effect in and of itself. However, while you're in the Second Empire, you get a +1 bonus every time you attack with the Imperial Guard. So you kind of want to, I mean, morale is good stuff, right? So you kind of want to use them in attacks, which means you can't just hide them and Napoleon to avoid this loss without some cost in potential morale bonuses. Then they go through the setup rules for the whole thing, which are pretty extensive and pretty much needed. I'm going to have to go through these and do them. You change government during the mobilization phase. German player's first player in each turn. However, in the first turn, he skips operations and mobilization. Okay, morale points. Those are specified on the player aid card. Really? Maybe they're specified here. Oh, yeah, when you spend points to do stuff, you have to roll a die to see if it actually has effect on this friction table. Okay, yeah, here's where the morale effects are. So eliminating units gives and takes morale. And then there's morale adjustments for occupying particular locations, which will be covered there. And some of that's governmental specific. Okay. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, unit. So normally, when detachments are lost, they count as half a unit for stacking and half a unit for morale. And that there's little half markers here, except there's an exception to the rule which makes those halves unnecessary because this weak unit losses all units that have a combat strength of 1, and that all is pretty specific to me, don't cause any morale loss when they're eliminated. Everything else will, though. We have this card symbols key here, which tells us what the effects, and we got kind of blue and black. It's hard to see, but it looks easier on the camera actually. And white changes indicate either side really. Hand size based on the government, and that's specified on the government card itself as well by showing you how many cards you hold. Supply trace, like I said, 3 hexes to a railroad for the Germans, 2 for the French. If you don't win the game through the standard victory of getting the other guy down to 0 morale, then at the end of the game we're going to count victory points. And the victory point values for the city are marked on the map in parentheses. Note Paris is a big 10. What's Trier? 5. The German cities are not things you want to lose. But Luxembourg, there's a card that makes Luxembourg part of Germany, and otherwise it's neutral. And more options. Here's the victory point split. Basically, you subtract the French points from the Germans, and the Germans have to get more than 10 additional points to get a victory of any kind. They had a decisive historically. Yeah, no shit. Okay. Optional rules for the specific rules are here too. The only one that's given is this tenacious withdrawals. When you get a withdrawal result on the combat chart, over here, an advance after combat is not automatic. The victor spends, he gains a friction point, and rolls a die, and only victorious units whose movement allowance is less than or equal to the die roll result can advance after combat. Interesting. So slower units have an easier time advancing. Kind of, it's a weird concept. I'm not sure I quite understand it. Okay, then there's an alternative scenario, and I'm going to be doing this. If you, instead of just playing for 12 turns, I'm going to go through 16 turns, which probably is an advantage for the Germans, I would guess, but we'll see. Political rules. Now, this is weird. These are tagged on at the very end. I don't know if they're meant to be, this is obviously optional. This is obviously optional. It's the alternative scenario, not the standard game, but this appears to be standard rules for the game. The government cards, and I can't see playing without them. Neutral countries, those rules. So it's just a weird organizational thing. The neutral countries are impossible to be entered. So Belgium and Switzerland will always be neutral. Luxembourg starts neutral, but the Germans can gain them, and then it becomes part of the game, which the French can take from Germany. And that's the sum of the rules for this. It seems fairly simple. I'm hoping I'm down to one video, but I'm really terrified I'm not. I'm going to cut this quick and not talk much more here. I'll talk more on the play.